The next lecture is in memory of Che Guevara, who needs no introduction, especially after Roberto Massari's lecture yesterday on Che Guevara and Marx. This lecture is titled, Marx's Idea and Conceptions of Socialism in the 21st Century, and will be delivered by Professor Tian Yu Cao. This lecture will be chaired by Dr. Gopa Sabharwal. Can I request the speaker and the chair to please come on stage? Gopa Sabharwal was the founding Vice-Chancellor of Nalanda University. A sociologist by training, she came to Nalanda University from India's foremost liberal arts college, Lady Shri Ram College for Women, where she founded the Department of Sociology in 1993. I request Dr. Sabharwal to take over the proceedings.
Afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce everybody to Professor Tian Yu Cao, who is a philosopher who achieved his PhD from the University of Cambridge and has been teaching at Boston University for many years. He's a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and also a visiting fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and a joint member of Historical Studies and Natural Science at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. Amongst Professor Chao's books are 3 books on the philosophy of science from the Cambridge University Press in 1997, 1999, and 2010. He was the editor of the Chinese Model of Human Development in 2006. He edited 2 volumes for Brill on culture and social transformation in 2011 and 12. And in Chinese, he has published in 2016, Power and Rationality, Marxism and Liberalism in World History. I would, without much ado, invite Professor Cao to deliver his lecture.
Thank you very much. Oh, can you hear? Yes, thank you very much. I'm grateful to the organizer of the conference, and especially to Professor Desai for inviting me to come to this conference and give me the opportunity, closer, okay, give me the opportunity of sharing my views of Marx and my views of socialism as a philosopher. Of course, socialism is only one of Marx's 3 major contributions to human intellectual history. The first is, of course, the conceptual framework for understanding the human society and human history, the historical materialism. The second is Marx's evaluation and criticism of capitalism. The third is Marx's program of transcending capitalism into socialism and communism. Of course, all these 3 areas are closely related, as you will see very soon, right? The time is precious. Let me just start. The collapse of the Soviet model, along with the decline of Keynesianism.
He wants you to be closer to the mic.
Okay.
We can also give you 2 mics. I don't know if
okay. Better. Much better. The decline of Keynesianism since the 1970s has posed a serious challenge to socialists. Is it still possible to conceive a theoretically coherent and practically viable economic model in which the socialist principle of no alienation is not compromised by the concern of productivity and efficiency? What would be the necessary conceptual resources for this endeavor? It seems that in the last 3 decades, all the available or conceivable conceptual resources have been exhaustively tried, but the challenge remains. In this talk, I would suggest that in taking up the challenge, some of Marx's ideas are more than instructive and inspiring. In fact, they have provided conceptual foundations for a socialist economic model that is both coherent and viable. Some skeptics in this room may raise their eyebrow. Is Marx still relevant in this endeavor? Isn't it true that Marx's ideas were responsible for the failure of the Soviet model, whose guiding principles, the state ownership of the means of production and central planning, were directly taken from Marx's teaching? It sounds true, but not quite. It was only the Soviet interpretation of Marx's conception of the two pillars of socialism, social property and conscious social regulation, articulated in Critique of Gopa program, Marx's most mature conception of what a socialist society should be like. However, there can be a different interpretation that I would argue is truer to the spirit of Marx's conception of socialism. The grounds for an alternative interpretation are provided by two of Marx's fundamental ideas about a post-capitalist society. One is the idea of the Republican Association of the Free and Equal Producers, conceived concerning the fundamental organization in any post-capitalist society. In its first phase, what we commonly call socialist society, as well as its higher phase, a truly communist society. The other idea is the idea of equal rights that concerns exclusively the economic foundations of the socialist but not communist society. The meaning of the first idea is clear-cut in its social and political aspects, a firm rejection of statism. Its meaning in economic aspect, however, depends on the economic foundations of the post-capitalist society. In the communist society, it means from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which is, while in socialist society, it can only mean the exchange of equal labors. And this directly leads us to Marx's second idea, whose implications to his conceptions of the two pillars of socialism deserves serious explorations. Before we proceed to the explorations, let me make another remark on socialism. According to Marx and Engels, socialism is not a doctrinaire design, but will be the outcome of the struggles and movements of the working classes in response to the capitalist condition of their existence. The fundamental condition for workers' existence in the contemporary world of globalization is the financialization of economic life and the dominance of financial capital. Although Marx's focus and emphasis is on the primacy of production, he also sees capitalist dynamics as being deeply intertwined with finance. Financial capital is what Marx calls moneyed capital that functions as an external agent providing the finance that launches the circuits of capital. Since the 1980s, non-financial enterprises, banks, and even working-class households in the advanced capitalist world have become increasingly implicated in the web of finance, the so-called financial inclusion. The discipline imposed by finance on production has bred the strategy of rationalize, retrench, and outsourcing, leading to greater concentration and centralization of all spheres of production on the one hand, and the growth of inequality and the concentration of wealth on the other. The role of financial capital, just as the role of one of its special form, the credit system, as Marx in Volume 3 of Capital indicates, has a dual character. On the one hand, it makes possible that the expansion of individual capitalist enterprises need not be limited to the reinvestment of their returned earnings, and thus accelerates the expansion of the scale of production. For the same reason, it also accelerates the development of technology and the creation of the world market. On the other hand, since it is driven by the capitalist impulse to make profit, it also accelerates the violent outbreak of contradiction and crisis. Marx's verdict is that credit system of financial capital credit system or financial capital in general as the principal lever of overproduction and excessive speculation, I quote from Marx, develops the motive of capitalist production, enrichment by exploitation of others' labor into the purest and most colossal system of gambling and sweetening, and restrict even more the already small number of the exploiters of social wealth, unquote. But what I want to stress here is that while we criticize all the evil motivations and evil consequences of financial capital, we should keep in mind Marx's sharp insights into its dual and contradictory nature. Underneath all the evils, there is a rationale for it to emerge in the historical development of capitalism. The ground on which financial capital is premised is the rational and productive separation of management from ownership of working conditions or capital in its generalized sense. The bearings of workers' experience with financial capitalism will be seen clearly when we move to the discussion of the evolution of economic formation in terms of Marx's idea of the socialization of economic activities. Let's begin our exploration exploring the implications of Marx's idea of equal right with a few well-known quotations. In Critique of Gopa program, Marx said, "What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundation, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the older society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly, the individual producers receives back from society after the deduction have been made exactly what he gives to it. That is, in the socialist society, I quote again, a given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form. This means the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities as far as this is exchange of equal values." Unquote. Essentially, what Marx said here is that the law of value will still be operative in the socialist society. Although there are restrictions, nothing but labor can enter into exchange, and nothing can pass to the ownership of the means of production. Considering the central place the law of value occupies in the understanding of socialism in history and at present, all of us know that Che Guevara was deeply involved in the great debate about the place of the law of value in the socialist society. Let's begin our explorations with an examination of the concept of value from the very beginning. The starting point is, of course, the classical theory of value, according to which the value of a commodity is determined by socially necessary labor for its production. But how the value is determined, or what kind of social process through which the value is formed, is an interesting yet not properly understood question, which involves how to understand the notion of value, market, and their relationship. A proper understanding of this issue would shed some light on an alternative model of socialist economy. To clear the way for understanding the social process through which value is formed, we have to first reject a non-social but naturalistic view about value. According to this naturalistic view, the amount of the socially necessary labor can be measured by the natural scale of time labor spent on its production. The reason for rejection is simple. Socially necessary labor is an abstraction of concrete nature, physical or mental labor. In its essence, socially necessary labor is not concrete laboring action anymore, but what is necessary to create what is socially needed, judged by society, which can only be evaluated by society through social processes. So it cannot be measured by the natural scale of laboring time, but can only be measured by its social scale, whose form is ultimately money. Another misleading thesis should also be revised. The thesis claims that abstract labor creates value. The thesis seems to presume the existence of abstract labor prior or simultaneous to value it creates. But this is unreasonable. Human activities in production are always concrete. They become value, socially necessary labor, only through a social economical process of abstraction, not because they involve the exercise of some general and thus abstract human physical and mental energy and effort, which remains to be natural, individual, rather than social, and thus have nothing to do with socially necessary labor until it is socialized in certain social processes. So it is correct to say that value is the abstraction of concrete labor through social processes, but improper to claim that abstract labor creates value. The gravest defects of this widespread but misleading thesis is that it excludes from the process of abstraction the adaptability or utility of different concrete labor to social demand. The exclusion betrays its untenable presupposition that social demand, supply and social demands are always in balance, which frequently turns out not to be the case. Surely, a concrete labor not needed by society cannot be recognized as a socially necessary labor. So the exclusion is practically impossible unless the abstraction of labor, the ascription of value to a concrete labor, is achieved by an authority's direct evaluation in a closed economy rather than through an open yet indirect social process of labor exchange or market transaction. Theoretically, the exclusion renders the labor theory of value unable to explain the formation and function of price that is closely related with utility. Of course, price frequently deviates from value, but when external factors such as monopoly, non-economic interventions, and market failures are absent, that is, in a fully competitive and complete market, the deviation is insignificant. Now we are ready to examine the value formation, which is premised on an understanding of commodity exchange. What is crucial for the emergence of commodity exchange or market exchange? I think a combination of three factors is sufficient for the emergence of market exchange. The first factor is the existence of different economic subjects who possess different products which are the materialized form of different labors. The difference among labors means the difference in kind. The fishing is different from shoemaking, and in quality, skilled or not. It also involves different material, technological, and organizational conditions under which labors are performed. How could these different labors be coordinated or exchanged between different economic subjects? This moves us to the second factor. If there is a direct knowledge of social demand for various different labors obtainable by each and all providers, then there is no need for market exchange, although non-market coordination would still be very difficult. But the lack of such kind of direct knowledge makes any non-market coordination impossible. The third factor is the lack of a unified measurement through which different labors can be directly measured and compared. A combination of these three factors would render market transaction inevitable for the socially necessary coordination of various labors, even in the society of public ownership. Central to this argument is the notion of adaptability of labor to social demand. Since whether or not or how good certain particular labor meets social demand could not be measured directly, all the differences involved in different labors have to be converted or abstracted to a unified measurement, without which no proper coordination or exchange would be possible. Yet the abstraction itself could only be achieved through a trial an era process of labor exchanges, namely through market transaction or market evaluation. The result of abstraction based on the adaptability of labor to demand is the formation of price. Then what is value? Value is the essence of price, the socially necessary labor, which explains the formation and the function of price. The notion of socially necessary labor accordingly expresses not only the quantity, but also the quality and the kind of a specific labor performed under specific material, technological, and managerial conditions that meets special social demand, and thus is at the same time an expression of social demand. Precisely because the supply-demand interactions affects the formation of labor abstraction, that is, value is formed through the process of price formation. Value can regulate supply and demand and bring a roughly balanced relationship between the two in a fully competitive and complete market system. Learning economy is to solve two problems: the allocation of labor and the exchange of labor. The former refers to economic structure, the latter affects efficiency. The historical inevitability of market economy lies in the fact that when the three factors discussed above exist, only such an economy could offer relatively effective solutions to them. The task of a proper theory of value is to offer a proper understanding of the underlying rationale for the working of market economy in terms of value formation. But the classical theory of value, without taking into consideration labor's adaptability to social demand, failed precisely around these two problems. Overlooking the adaptability of particular labor to social demand is to neglect the key fact that the structure of social demand cannot be directly known and grasped. Overlooking the difference between different labors is to ignore the difficulty and indeed impossibility of directly measuring labor. The hidden assumption of classical theory is that labor can be directly measured, allocated, and exchanged. Theoretically, it is untenable and was sharply criticized by one of my heroes, Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin. At the early stage of Soviet economy, practically its implications are disastrous, as was vindicated by Russia's war communism from 1918 to 1921, and by other experiments on command economy afterwards. This understanding of value offers a perspective from which we may take the rise of the product market as the first step in the direction of socializing production. It is historically necessary and inevitable because it is the only way to address two key questions in any society in which three factors exist: the structural balance and efficiency. Of course, all of us know very well about the negative potentials of market, polarization, inequality, and class divisions, not self-regulating, such as anarchy and periodic convulsions, monopoly and manipulation, nurturing a culture of greed, fear, and other forms of alienation and destruction. But we also have to realize and recognize that the constitutive core of market is competitive equal exchanges. And this core has great positive potentials and thus should be preserved. More importantly, since the operation of market cannot be detached from its context, legal and regulative institutions for legitimating and regulating productive, trading, tax, environmental, and financial activities in relevant markets, and cultural norms, bonds, and values that condition and constrain markets, we may argue that the nature of market is subordinated to and even constituted and dictated by the nature of the context. Thus, if the legal, political institutions and cultural norms are capitalist in nature, then market can only be an integrated part of the capitalism with all the negative consequences that the market critics frequently cite. but in the context in which a set of socialist political legal institutions, cultural legitimations, and regulatory regimes is firmly established and installed, a socialist market can be materialized. At the minimum, the socialist context can prevent markets' inherent logic of chasing profit from colonizing the political, social, and cultural sphere as Habermas hoped for. At the maximum, the context can constrain markets' logic by a renewed logic of reciprocity, redistribution, and communality with a socialist rather than pre-capitalist Polanyian character in organizing economic activities so that social inclusion can be promoted, political participation can be encouraged, and consumer culture can be replaced by a communal and humanist culture. In the socialist society, we have to stress that first, in areas where social demand can be known, or there are market failures, or natural monopolies, or vital national interests, central planning is feasible and desirable, and should be the guiding principle without conceding to marketization. Second, the core task for a socialist government's regulation in areas where market is allowed to play a fundamental role is to make sure that no forms of monopoly in capital and information is allowed. And all institutional designs and government policies should aim at universal and equal access to capital and information for all citizens. With these caveats, we can safely claim that market mechanism as a mode of production and coordination cannot be equated with capitalism. Capitalism is a regime of endless capital accumulation through profit chasing by private owners of capital, while market mechanism is compatible with various social systems depending on context in which it is operating. Since market mechanism does not depend on private ownership and is not intrinsically contradictory with public property, as we will see shortly, the capitalist market based on private ownership can only be viewed as an alienated form of market, and the true rule of the market requires the abolition of closed private property through an equal and universal access to social property and or social capital, understood as the working conditions, mediated by a socialist capital market that is supported by a socialist political power and legal institutions and guided by the socialist cultural norms. We may mobilize Marx's organizing principle of socialization to justify market's compatibility or even necessity to socialism. From a very general and historical perspective, Marx cultivates an idea that in the historical development of human economic activities, there is a general tendency of moving from a closed or autarkic economy toward a more and more open and socialized economy. That is, production and demand are more and more socially defined. The emergence of the product market, labor market, capital and financial market, accordingly, can be viewed as representing different levels of socialization, and each level features a historical epoch. Thus, the emergence of wage labor system features a transition from the closed feudal economy to an open capitalist economy, in which laborers are freed from personal attachment and non-economic coercion. As a result, the labor resources can be more efficiently allocated than before. But the wage system is not part of a fully developed integral market, since we may argue the transactions happened in the labor market are not equal exchange of labor. Of course, Marx claimed that labor market transactions are equal exchanges. The exploitation occurs only in the process of production, in which surplus labor is appropriated as a source of profit. But if we pay enough attention to the following facts, a different view of the labor market may also be possible. First, what a capitalist buys and a laborer sells in the labor market actually is not labor power, but refers to a certain concrete labor. to be delivered later as the contract specified. Second, such a concrete labor as a commodity has a value which is constituted by the social process of abstraction mentioned earlier. Third, once this is clarified, the unequal nature of the labor market transaction is not difficult to see. Obviously, no capitalist pays the full value of the concrete labor he buys. Otherwise, no profit would be possible. What the capitalist pays can only be the remainder of the full value of the concrete labor a worker sells with the subtraction of a rent the capitalist claims for offering the workers the opportunity of performing his labor, namely for providing the workers the working conditions so that the workers can perform and sell his labor to the capitalist. The rent is also determined by the market through competition, and which will approach an equilibrium, the average rate of profit. The same amount of capital gets the same amount of profit or rent. At a very abstract level, we may say that the tendency in the evolution of the wage system is towarding a labor market of equal exchange. But its realization premises on the socialization of capital, which in fact features a new historical epoch and characterizes the transition from capitalism to socialism. Capitalism is characterized by the separation of workers from the means of production, which is controlled by private owners, who thereby controls workers' demand and receive rent, and thus make equal exchange of labor market impossible. Yet it seems to require no talent to note that nationalization and the state ownership of the means of production is not a proper form of socialization of capital. The closed monopolized ownership by the state blocks the way to an integral market of capital and thus undermines the very ground for universal individual access to capital, or the removal of the workers' separation from the working condition, which is the economic foundations for socialism. We should greatly appreciate Marx's idea of a post-capitalist socialized individual ownership by free producers organized in free association. The desirability of public, open, and universally available character of social capital entails a call for capitalist markets, whose nature is critically conditioned by the context in which these markets are operating, as we have already noticed and will be clarified further shortly. The transition from monopolized closed to socialized open capital is a long historical process, critically relying on the separation of the managing rights from ownership of the capital. However, the separation of the ownership and management of capital, or the property rights of capital, or the property rights of all kinds of working conditions is a commonplace in modern organization of production, service, circulation, and finance. This is especially true in the era of globalization. In fact, the separation has provided an ontological foundation for financial capitalism, as we noticed earlier. The economic meaning of ownership of capital being separated from its control, management, and use is largely reduced to the income derived thereby. This causes the principal agent problem, but the fact that the formal ownership alone cannot promise full control and appropriation of the residual is beyond dispute. We may cite Marx in this regard to strengthen our position. When Marx touched upon the stock company that is the result of the capital market involving a dialectics of fictitious and real capital, Marx said that the capital is here directly endowed with the form of social capital, and its undertaking assumes the form of social undertaking as distinct from private undertakings. It is abolition of capital as private property within the framework of capitalist production itself, and the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself. and hence a self-dissolving contradiction which per se represents a mere phase of transition to a new form of production, that is socialism. What Marx said here, with some modification, can be said to the capitalist market in general, the financial markets included, whose developments in scope and depth in the last 4 decades have gone far beyond what were conceptualized by Marx. But the persuasiveness of Marx's insights into the dual character of these developments remain the same. If the separation of management from pure ownership or the separation of the functioning capital from money capital and fictitious capital is the key in socializing capital, then it should be applicable to both private and public ownership, such as collectively owned land and state property, so that a complete and healthy capital market can be developed. In fact, a complete and healthy capital market is a desirable structure for socializing capital, namely for providing individually dispersed associated producers and universally equalized access to capital, which in my view is a necessary institutional basis for labor's liberation from the control of closed either capitalist or state ownership. If such socialization can be viewed as a strategic alternative to privatization in replacing statist socialism, a complete socialization of product, labor, capital, land, management, knowledge, and other human and natural resources, and even risks involved in economic activities realized in relevant markets should be duly recognized as constitutive to the economic foundation of socialism. Once having cleared the theoretical ground for understanding market in terms of socialization in Marx's sense, we are in the position to further discuss market's compatibility and even constitutive necessity, necessity to socialism, more than just its interim expedient at the primary stage of socialism. In this endeavor, first, we have to dissociate socialism from its statist Soviet or Keynesian models and return to its basic principles, no alienation and efficiency. Second, we have to notice that institutional public ownership and central planning in the socialist society will keep their important roles, but their roles will be demoted from foundational, and their foundational process will be occupied by social ownership mediated by capital markets and by market coordination dictated by the law of value, whose grounding role was duly recognized and stressed by Marx in his critique of God program. Third, and decisively, we have to have enough strategic and constitutive moves to develop a socialist market that can avoid the negative effects of historically developed capitalism markets and while reserve its positive core, that is competitive and exchange. Okay, very quick. The underlying idea is to radically transform market's fundamental ontology and the context in which market operates. More specifically, the market players should not be selfish individuals blindly chasing for private interests. Rather, these market players should be various communities, enterprises, trade unions, bankers, investment institutions, etc. These communities manage and use, but not own, their working conditions, which they acquire from the social pool of capital through capital markets. Internally, these communities are organized as the Republican Association of Free Producers, conceived by Marx in his critique of Gopa program. That is, these Republican associations as market players are organized in democratic ways for decision-making on economic issues. Most importantly among them are the income level of capital owners and managers, hiring and firing, distribution of accumulation and consumption. And the political issues, most important among them, is the power distribution within the community. Externally, in addition to market relations with other market players, they are subject to democratically organized socialist governmental regulation at relevant levels, also guided by socialist values and norms. These Marxian associations, new kind of market players, have provided the only institutional setting in which moral incentives can flourish and dominate human psyche and behavior, which Che Guevara took as the decisive factor for socialism. Without these institutional settings, Guevara's moral idealism would be groundless. In order to avoid the communitarian trap of exclusiveness and distinguish itself from the anarchic syndicalism, in this model, all newcomers getting into an association through labor market should automatically enjoy a full membership of the association and the related inalienable membership rights. With the changed players and the changed institutional context, the logic of the socialist market will be radically different from the logic of the capitalist market. While competition and incentives remain to be the core of the market for effective information processing that is necessary for efficiency, the motivation and goals are no longer focused on exclusive infinite accumulation of capital through chasing profit, but rather on reciprocity and communal, regional, national, balanced economic development for meeting human needs. Thus, the result of market activity would not be polarization, class division, and exclusion, but rather inclusion, trust, personal empowerment in free choice and in decision-making. With these foundational, okay, I think I still have 2 minutes, okay. With these foundational changes, the labor market will no longer be the mechanism through which workers are exploited, but rather a mechanism through which workers' freedom is realized. Workers entering an enterprise will enjoy full membership rights equal to all other members, not as employees. Those fired and leave the enterprise will have basic income to rely on and will have the right to receive self-chosen training for re-entering a preferable enterprise. These opportunities, this retraining opportunity should be offered by regional or national government, funded by regional or national pool of social capital. Similarly, the capital markets and financial markets will no longer be places for speculation leading to volatility, but rather for effective use of capital in various forms of property rights of working conditions through value discovery, which is a great help in structural adjustment and various innovations, and thus facilitates the change of government's function from administrative planning to regulations. A conclusion can be reached that is that markets are not only compatible with socialism, but rather in terms of their subjects understood as communities in which workers and all other members enjoy equal status and rights, stipulated and protected by a socialist constitution. And in terms of the commons understood as socially usable resources, assets, knowledge, and activities, realized through capital and financial markets, markets provided only desirable and feasible economic form in realizing socialist principles, no alienation and efficiency. For all this to be possible, however, workers' socialist political will and political power are decisive. Their inalienable Republican rights within association and without, regionally and nationally, have to be clearly stipulated in Constitution and protected by legal institutions. Also to be clearly stipulated in Constitution and protected by legal institutions is the equal and universal access by all associated citizens to capital, information, and service, which is crucial for the capital market to become a mechanism of creating the socialist commons. They are decisive also because the coordination and the regulation of markets have to be guided by the socialist political will and carried out by the socialist political power structures. Then the crucial question is, how could such a socialist political will and such a socialist political power structure emerge from today's capitalist environment? But this practical and strategic issue is beyond the scope of this talk and remain to be properly addressed in other occasions. Thank you very much.
So we, can you hear me? We overshot on time by a few minutes, but what we could do is, the note I got said that we should try and curtail the question entirely, but if there are questions, I can quickly, we can collect one round and maybe have a shortened question and answer session so that we don't eat into the next session, and some of the question answers can go into the tea break. So we'll start with you at the back. Could I just see the hands so that I know once and for all? There's 1, 2, you, right? Okay, so these are the 3 we'll take, and then we will give over to the next session. Please.
Yeah, I think you can argue for market socialism, but I don't think you can. You can argue market socialism in the name of Karl Marx. You interpreted the Marxian view of socialism as a market socialism, quoting Marx texts like Gopa program. And according to your interpretation of Marx Gopa program, it's early phase of communism is market socialism. But if we read the text carefully, it is very obvious that Marx already assumed that the market and value and wage labor and state all abolished in the first early stage of communism. So I don't think so. Although, but you even argues that it's early phase of communism, not just market, but it's the labor market exists. So, and I don't think, and I think Marx himself already criticized, radically the sort of it's the idea of market socialism, even in early days. I think it's very consistently Marx himself criticized the idea of socialism. For example, Marx criticized Proudhon. Proudhon's theory is nothing else than the theory of market socialism. So I think, yeah, that is my point.
Marx himself wrote a
Oh. Let me respond to this first. And this question, of course, the issue I address is very controversial. But if we really take Marx's spirit in his critique of Goethe's program, the spirit is that in the socialist stage of the communism, the law of value still is the fundamental regulative principle for all economic activities. Now, if we take the law of value, this fundamental law, as seriously as Marx takes it, then we have to flesh out this idea into the real economic activities. Now, there are 2 things more, because also in the critique of the Goethe program, he mentioned 2 things are crucial. One is the social property. The other is conscious social regulation. How can we have a socially conscious social regulation? This social regulation cannot be regulation at will. You have to be guided by the fundamental economic law of the law of value, as Marx understood. Right? The second is social property. How can we achieve the social property? Social property cannot be the nationalization or state ownership cannot be the proper form of social capital or social property. So in order to socialize the capital, socialize the property, you have to find a mechanism. Marx did not specify what is the proper mechanism for socializing the properties. Now we have to develop the idea with the experience of today's capitalism, meaning the financial capitalization. The underlying rationale for all these things is the separation of the ownership and the controlling or managing rights. This separation undermines the fundamental role Marx conceived as the ownership. Ownership determinism is not that important in today's time. We can see it clearly. You own the things that you cannot control. Real things is who can control the economic activity, who can control. In my scheme, that is the association of the producers they can control. Of course, there's another question of Proudhon and Bakunin. I said that in order to distinguish from the so-called anarchic syndicalism, socialism, right? We have to notice that, I said that, you may not be noticed that the anarchic syndicalism has a trap, we call the communitarian trap, that is the exclusiveness of the members out of the community and members within the community. My scheme is that once you agree that every member, every producer get into a community, we automatically share all the membership rights. Okay.
We are cutting into the next session. So what I will do is collect all three questions and allow one short answer, and then everything will have to wait for tea time. So could you keep your questions brief, please? We're starting from here first.
I will do. Professor, I have deep appreciation for what you've said.
Can you speak a little louder?
Okay. I have really deep appreciation and respect for what you said. The vision that you have presented is something for which we all look forward to. However, the way you espouse that vision, ultimately the man getting into a communitarian state where the market will work not for an unequal exchange, but in an equality of exchange to rather enhance dignity, all that sounds great, but what kind of a man as a theory you actually think of? The man so far, as Thomas Harden would argue, as the prisoner's dilemma would argue, is a man who would maximize the utility by cutting the throats of others. If he's getting into a market situation, he will always try to maximize his utility. In which case, how do you see that thing happening? How do you see that transition taking place? When you yourself say that the political and social will has to be brought in, but how that political and social will which will create that kind of a scenario is beyond the scope of this paper.
Go there, yeah.
I think that it's pretty difficult to imagine a modern complex society without any market. So I agree in that, for instance, market in consumption goods might be a good way to allocate resources. But isn't it also important to decommodify sectors of economy like healthcare, education? For instance, that is the case in my country, not in Finland, not long anymore, but at the moment, healthcare is not allocated according to market principles, but everybody gets according to her need and contributes via taxes according to her abilities.
And last question here at the back.
So these two are more or less the same line. My question is the following. I think what you are doing, you are providing an intellectual defense of what is happening in the People's Republic of China. The question I'm asking is the following. In your market-based system, what is the role for the private sector? Because any socialist market economy, it's not obvious what role the private sector should have. And even if you want to allow the private sector, why do you want to allow the private sector in capital goods production, means of production?
Okay, let me briefly respond. I think the second question, third question, I can answer in one sentence. This talk is about the conceptual foundations of the political economy of the socialism, how the political will form, how the education or whatever cultural norm. I assume in the society, political will already there. Political power structure is already there. Right? Then what would be the way to run an economy? The third question, last question about China. I think it's irrelevant to China. My talk is about the possible conception of a political economy of socialism. China has nothing to do with the socialist political will. China has nothing to do with socialist political power structure. Everything is capitalism. As I said, if the power structures, legal structures, everything is capital, of course it is capitalism. Okay, I think I answered all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.